The family reunion was in full swing, just as it was every summer, with the Rothwells filling every corner of the sprawling estate. As usual, I moved quietly through the house, unseen and unheard, making sure everything was perfect. The crystal glasses gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the massive windows, the silverware sparkled on the long dining table, and the champagne was chilled to exactly the right temperature. They didn't notice me, not really. To them, I wasn't a person, just the housekeeper, an old fixture of the estate they thought they owned. "Mrs. Calloway," barked Eleanor Rothwell, the eldest daughter, from across the room, snapping her manicured fingers at me. "The flowers in the foyer are wilting. Replace them immediately. We can't have our guests seeing that." She didn't even look at me as she spoke, too busy scrolling through her phone. I gave a quiet nod and headed toward the foyer, suppressing the urge to roll my eyes. As I replaced the flowers, Eleanor's younger brother, Charles, strolled past, laughing with his wife. He glanced at me and smirked. "Still here, Mrs. Calloway? You'd think after all these years, you'd retire. I mean, who works their entire life for someone else?" His wife chuckled, her laughter light and dismissive. "She probably doesn't have much of a choice," she said, leaning closer to him. "Poor thing. It must be sad, living your whole life in someone else's shadow." I said nothing, as I always did. Let them think what they wanted. It wasn't my place yet. Dinner was the main event, of course, with the Rothwells sitting at the head of the table, holding court as they always did. Marcus Rothwell, the patriarch, raised his glass for a toast, his booming voice silencing the room. "To family," he declared. "To the legacy we've built together, and the one we'll continue to pass down to future generations." Applause followed, the sound of self-congratulation ringing through the air. I stood by the door, ready to assist if needed, though none of them would ever acknowledge me. As they ate, I caught bits and pieces of their conversation. Marcus was boasting about the estate again, as he always did. "This house has been in our family for generations," he said proudly, gesturing to the ornate woodwork and marble floors. "A testament to our success, our legacy. There's nothing like it." "Nothing like it," Eleanor echoed, sipping her wine. "And it's all ours. No one else could ever understand the responsibility of maintaining something so grand. It takes a certain caliber of person." She glanced at me as she said it, her gaze cold and dismissive. As the meal continued, the conversation turned to business. Marcus began grilling his sons about their latest ventures. "Charles, what's the status of that new partnership?" he asked, leaning forward. "Still in negotiations," Charles replied, a flicker of nervousness crossing his face. "The property's owner is being difficult. They're holding out for a better offer." "Well, push harder," Marcus snapped. "We can't afford to lose that deal. It's a prime location, and we need it in the family portfolio. Do whatever it takes." I nearly laughed aloud. I knew the deal he was talking about, because I was the difficult owner refusing to sell. It had been amusing watching them try to maneuver their way into a negotiation with me, not realizing they were talking to the same woman who brought them tea and ironed their tablecloths. As the evening wore on, the Rothwells grew louder, their arrogance filling the room like a tangible presence. Marcus pulled me aside at one point, his expression stern. "Mrs. Calloway, the champagne service was slow earlier. I expect better from you. This house deserves perfection, and if you can't manage that, perhaps it's time we find someone who can." I nodded, biting back a smile. "Of course, sir. I'll do better." The final straw came when Eleanor cornered me in the kitchen, holding a glass of wine. "You've been with us a long time, haven't you, Mrs. Calloway?" she asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She tilted her head, studying me. "You know, it's admirable, in a way. Staying in your place for so long, never wanting more. I suppose some people are just content with mediocrity." I nodded again, saying nothing. It was time. Once the dinner ended and the guests began to disperse, I stepped into the main hall, catching Marcus's attention. "Sir," I said politely, holding a folder in my hand. "There's something I need to show you." He frowned, clearly irritated, but he followed me into the study, where we wouldn't be overheard. "What is it, Mrs. Calloway? Can't this wait?" "I'm afraid not," I replied, handing him the folder. He opened it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents inside. Slowly, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to shock. What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. "It's the deed to the estate," I said calmly. "And the financial records for the company that owns it." "My company?" He stared at me, his face pale. "What are you talking about?" "This is our estate, our family's estate." "Not anymore," I said. "You sold it years ago, remember? To a private buyer? That buyer was me. I've owned it ever since." He shook his head, as if trying to deny the reality in front of him. This can't be, why didn't you say anything? You never asked, I replied. For a moment, he was silent, his mind racing. Then he glared at me, his arrogance faltering. You think this changes anything? We're the Rothwells. I'm the owner of this house, I interrupted, my voice firm. And the person you've been trying to negotiate with for months about that property deal? That's me too. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I left him there, stunned, and returned to the ballroom. The others were still laughing, oblivious to what had just happened. The silence after my announcement stretched long and uncomfortable. The family members exchanged stunned glances, their previously smug expressions replaced with disbelief and confusion. My employer, George, the once proud patriarch of the family, was the first to recover. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. This is absurd, he said, his voice quaking with indignation. You expect us to believe that you, our housekeeper, somehow bought this estate? His tone dripped with condescension, as if the very idea was beneath him. It's not an expectation, I replied evenly. It's a fact. I now own this house. The title has been transferred, the bank has no stake in it, and the paperwork is all legal and binding. Shall I fetch the documents for you to examine? You've gone mad, interjected Margaret, his haughty wife, who clutched the pearls around her neck as if they might strangle her. You're just the help. This is some kind of scam, a cruel joke. No scam, I replied calmly. No joke. For years, I've worked quietly, saving and investing every penny. While you treated me like I was invisible, I was paying attention. I knew this house would come under financial strain long before you did. And when the bank was ready to foreclose, I was there to purchase it. You never noticed because, as you've always made clear, you never really saw me. The room exploded with protests. Victoria, George and Margaret's eldest daughter, stood up with her hands on her hips. You're bluffing, she sneered. You don't have the resources to pull this off. I mean, look at you. You're just you. You don't have the power to do something like this. I held her gaze, unflinching. And yet, here we are. Enough of this nonsense. George barked. He turned to his son, Paul, the so-called businessman who had done little more than squander the family fortune. Paul, call the lawyer. We'll sort this out immediately. That won't be necessary, I said, my voice firm. You'll find that all the legal channels have been followed to the letter. This house is no longer yours, and you no longer have the authority to dictate what happens here. Margaret's face twisted in anger. How dare you speak to us like this? After everything we've done for you, giving you a roof over your head, paying you a salary. Everything you've done for me? I repeated, my voice rising for the first time. Let me remind you, I earned that salary. I worked tirelessly to keep this house running while you lived in excess and treated me like dirt beneath your feet. You've berated me, mocked me, and dismissed me as if I were less than human. Everything I have now, I achieved on my own, no thanks to any of you. The room fell silent again. Even George seemed momentarily at a loss for words. But Victoria wasn't finished. So, what's your plan, then, she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Kick us all out and live here by yourself? Do you even know what it takes to maintain a house like this? I smiled faintly. Oh, I know exactly what it takes. After all, I've been the one maintaining it all these years. My gaze swept over the assembled group, their faces pale and tense. And yes, I will be asking you to leave. You have 1 week to vacate the premises. You can't do that. Margaret shrieked. This is our home. It was your home, I corrected. Now, it's mine. And frankly, you've overstayed your welcome. George stepped forward, his face red with fury. This is outrageous. We'll fight this. You can't just throw us out like common criminals. You're welcome to fight it, I said, crossing my arms. But you'll find that the law is on my side. And as for throwing you out, I'm giving you far more notice than you deserve. A week is generous, considering how you've treated me. Paul, who had been silent until now, tried a different approach. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot, he said, his tone oily and insincere. You don't really want to kick us out, do you? I mean, think of the history here. This house has been in our family for generations. And now it's the beginning of a new chapter, I said, cutting him off. One where this house is finally appreciated and cared for, rather than used as a backdrop for your vanity. Margaret turned to George, her voice trembling. Do something, George. We can't just let this servant take everything from us. George opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not your servant anymore. I'm the owner of this house, and I'm giving you a chance to leave with dignity. If you don't take it, I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." The room descended into chaos as they all began speaking at once, their protests overlapping in a cacophony of anger and disbelief. I stood silently, letting them vent their frustrations. They had ruled over this house for so long, convinced of their own superiority, that the idea of losing it was incomprehensible to them. When the shouting finally subsided, I spoke again, my tone calm but firm. "You've spent years looking down on me, treating me like I was beneath you. But the truth is, I've always been the one holding this household together. You just never bothered to see it. Now, you'll have to learn to stand on your own, or fall apart trying." They stared at me, their faces a mix of anger, disbelief, and, finally, regret. The realization was sinking in, slowly but surely. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and now they were paying the price. "I suggest you start packing," I said, turning toward the door. "Your week starts now." As I left the room, I heard Margaret burst into tears, George's voice rising in futile protest, and the others scrambling to come up with a plan. But there was nothing they could do. The house was mine, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Like and subscribe.